Okay, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Nikki Stevens, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today is Keith Kirby. For those of you from Oxford, I'm sure he's a familiar face, but he is a leading forest ecologist, and he's an honorary research fellow, associate research fellow at the University of Oxford. He used to work for Natural England, and his career over time has been focusing on woodland ecology. And as you'll see today, he's made some incredible long-term, or a focus on long-term ecology, but made some incredible insights based on his long-term work at Wytham Woods. Um, and also, he has a very nice blog called The Old Man of Wytham. So that is also really fun to read. So I highly recommend that. And yeah, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. And what I want to explore is the importance of long-term records um, as a way of putting our current observations into context. And I'll be focusing particularly on some of the vegetation changes up at Wytham to illustrate that I've been involved with, but I will be bringing in at least a token attempt at some of the changes in other groups as well. And shameless plug, if you want any more information, this book has literally just been published. So um, unfortunately, it's OUP, so it's incredibly expensive, but there you are. Let's go. Right. So um, a week is a long time in politics is a well-known phrase, and we're living through one of those periods right now. But it's only 0.004% of the time that this particular tree in Wytham has experienced. And for those of you doing doctoral theses at the moment, your doctoral thesis is only 0.08% of the lifespan of that oak. And uh, in 1990, this guy Magnuson produced this little paper, which I find quite inspiring. But his point is that we don't sense with any precision the changes that occur over decades. And yet that's the scale at which things like climate change, pollution, but also the dynamics of forestry and woods work. And so he termed this phrase the invisible present, the period that influences what we see today, and with these long-lived these long-lived organisms like trees. And in particular, I will be drawing on the work that this guy up here, Collier Dawkins, initiated in 1974. And yes, he is related to the now more famous Richard. He's his uncle, or was his uncle. So he had been frustrated when he worked as a forest researcher out in Africa, that he was not able to find the plots that had been set up by Paul Richards in the 1930s, even though he had access to one of the local researchers who had helped Paul set up those plots. And so an amazing study of tropical forests was totally wasted because they couldn't re-record them. Anyway, came back to Britain, was in the forestry department, as it was then. And so he got a grant to set up a series of what he hoped would be long-term vegetation plots in Wytham Woods to test a way of making sure that the data that he collected could be refound, reused for decades to come. So he and colleagues battled their way through the woods using surveyor's chains and compasses, because this is 1974 and pre-GPS, putting in posts at roughly, well, at 100-meter intervals based on the Ordnance Survey grid, and then at every other point on that grid, shown by the little signs up there, symbols up there, they put in a vegetation plot. So the 160 of these plots, 10 by 10 meters, tree and ground flora records, and a certain amount of soil data was also collected. And they were marked by underground metal markers, which he hoped would survive. Basically a bit of gas pipe with a stainless steel core about this size hammered into the ground, nothing above ground to show where the plot was, although the post markers are the orange top posts. You can see my partner there in 1976 wearing an Afghan goat coat. So it's there. And he wrote it up, published it, distributed the results. But of course, by 5 to 10 years later, when they were due for recording, he had retired. His colleagues had moved on in their careers. No one else in the department seemed to be interested. The data were not being used. By this stage, I should say that I'd started working in the woods in 1974 studying brambles. Don't ask why. It was a sort of fancy thing to do in those days to measure the productivity. And bramble covered a third of the woods, so it was the obvious plant to study. Totally useless. Well, not entirely useless, as we'll see, but pretty useless it seemed at the time. But it got me a DPhil, let's say. And I went on to work with the Nature Conservancy Council as a forest ecologist for them. And in the 1980s, we suddenly got interested in how we monitored the dynamics of our woodland nature reserves. And it suddenly occurred to me that Collier had actually set up a system in Wytham. And so in the 1980s, I managed to persuade my boss that he could let me off for 2 weeks and I would go and see whether we could find any of these plots and start to look at how they'd changed. And we got round, found about a quarter of them. And then in 1991, I persuaded him that it was worth us trying to do a full re-recording. So we started the process of re-recording the plots. And as I say, a quarter done in 84, then we did the full re-recording in 91, again in 1999, 2001, you can see through to 2023, roughly every 5 to 10 years. And you can see how some of them have changed. Unfortunately, I didn't take photographs in some of the earlier recordings, at least not that many. One or two from 84, but you can see that some plots change quite a lot. The top line, the bottom line has not changed too much. And that's one of the problems with long-term research. You don't know whether anything is going to change much. Quite often it doesn't. And that means it's not easy to get funding. This is not the sort of thing that research councils like, because what are you doing? You're repeating something that someone else has already done. Is there going to be anything exciting? You don't know. Often there won't be, because woodlands change only slowly. But they do change. And what I want to show you is why you need to have those long-term records, because if you only look at things in the short term, you may not get the full picture. So let's start with what is a common research type timescale, the PhD or DPhil, 4 to 5 years. And let's take the most recent period, 2000 to 2023. And imagine you're a student. This is your project. And you look at the change that's happened in in the ash cover over the wood, which has been affected by ash dieback. And the ash cover has dropped from about 25% down to about 18%, the blue line. Well, quite dramatic change there. Oak, no change. Well, that's nice. You probably use an impact of the disease. What's happened to the ground flora? Well, bramble has gone up. And there's one particular plot photographed from more or less the same point. You can see in 2018, there's some bramble there, but half the plot is grass. 2023, well, it was a struggle to get back to the same point because the bramble was up to here. It was a machete job to get there, to take the photograph. So you actually have quite a nice story to tell in your thesis. So here we've got an introduced disease coming in, disrupting the tree canopy, and with a cascading effect through to the ground flora because of the opening up of the canopy. And you might go back to this idiot who studied bramble in the 1970s and actually created some small clearings. And this was some of my results. The x-axis is increasing leaf height, y-axis is increasing leaf density as measured by plots. So basically, any line going right and upwards implies increasing bramble density and height cover. And the dotted line, dashed line is for plots in small clearings that I'd created as against the solid line of the control. So, within a year of creating that little gap, bramble had nearly doubled its biomass impact. So experimental evidence that opening up the canopy increases the bramble as if you needed it. So you've got a nice story. But what if we look at the data over a longer period? Let's take the site manager's view. Nigel Fisher, young Nigel Fisher up at the top there. He came in at about 2000. What's the story then? Well, ash is canopy, the blue line, you can see it's fairly steady around that 25% cover over that period. Obviously the drip dot then down from 2018. Oak, again, still fairly stable. But look at what the bramble was doing. It wasn't just the last 5 years it's increasing. It's been increasing from a very low level back in 1999. So suddenly it looks as though it may not be just ash dieback, which has caused its increase. Something else must have been happening as well. So if you look at the other big change that had been going on in that period, it's in deer numbers. They crashed between 1995 and 2000, and they're creeping up, particularly the muntjac there, and the fallow deer are still pretty low. So maybe actually it's the change in the deer that were driving the brambles, and any increase in light is just an afterthought. Well, yeah. But that leads us to a question. What was the long-term state of the wood? Was it as in 2011 with high ash cover, high deer numbers and low bramble cover? Here's that oak tree, the broad oak there, and a very grassy ground flora underneath it. Or was it more like 2024? That's the same tree. It's now surrounded by bramble. Reduced ash, lower deer, high bramble cover. Because if we're managing the wood for biodiversity, we want to have some idea as to what's the stable state, if there is one. Well, perhaps if we look at an even longer term period, we'll get an idea. So this is going back now to 1974. Oh, a change again. Ash was not as abundant in 1974. It had been steadily increasing up to the more recent period just before ash dieback. And it's clear now that oak, rather than being just pottering around about 10%, had actually been much more common and has been declining. And what we're looking at is, over this 50-year period, is ash gradually replacing oak in the canopy. It was the fastest growing tree. It was showing the most regeneration. The pie chart on the right shows the number of plots which would contain seedlings or sapling of different tree species. And I just draw your attention to ash, which was in 101 plots, was showing some sort of seedlings, and the little black sliver, which was oak. So what we were looking at, apparently, was a replacement of oak by ash in this period. And that's, again, illustrated by another study that was looking at just a 2-hectare plot in this case, 1968, so a similar sort of time period. The plot was chosen for a particular study because it was predominantly an oak canopy, those black dots. And ash are the little brown triangles. So I think there are 6 of them, 7 of them. By 2021, you can see that ash has really come up into the canopy and is crowding out the oak. In fact, it is one of the things which is contributing to the oak decline in the woods, that the older trees are getting shaded out by this younger growth of ash. And what had been happening to the bramble? Well, bramble had actually, you can see, had been even more in 1974 than it is now. And Chris Perrins, who was doing bird research in that period, recounts having to use ladders to lay across the brambles in order to get to the trees to look at his nest boxes. And one of the reasons it was so abundant was almost certainly because there were very few deer. In the bad winter of 63, 62, 63, Mick Southern tracked the Wytham deer herd, all 13 animals of them, across the frozen Thames when they walked to Cassington, and then they walked back again. So there were 13. So we've got to then think about the fact that we've now got a position where we've got to explain why the deer suddenly increased. If we assume that is a genuine thing, it looks as though they probably were did have the impact that we were thinking on bramble, which is a major food plant for them in the winters. So that explains the dip and then the recovery as the deer population is now kept at a lower level. And just as an aside, understanding this relationship is important because, as we'll see, deer had increased is not just a thing that happens in Wytham, it's something that happens elsewhere. But what we really need to know is what triggered this shift in the ash-oak relationship, and let's say the deer population change. So let's go back even further. We're now before the period of the permanent plot, so we're reliant on other types of information. And in particular, I'm drawing on the diaries of this guy here, one Charles Elton, who gives us a lovely picture in his diaries. That's the top slide up there, but they've now all been digitized and they're available on the Bodleian library, of what the woods were like. They suffered widespread felling during the Second World War, as had many woods across the country for the war effort. And they, as you say, they're also described as in shocking decay because of the violent rabbit barking over recent years. Rabbit earths are numerous and some fresh. Rabbits were the threat to young trees at that point. Deer, well, there are only 13 of them in 63. There were even fewer in 1940s. The large trees are mainly oak. The management plan written in 1949 did a rough breakdown between trees that were less than about a foot in diameter, 35 centimeters, and those bigger than that. And as you can see, oak, the bigger, dominates in the bigger trees, the black lines, ash, there. So what triggered the burst of ash? Well, it's the myxomatosis in 1953-54, a virus disease illegally introduced into Britain to control the rabbits, which are causing a huge problem in agriculture. And it wiped out, well, effectively all but a handful of rabbits, not just in Wytham, but across the country. They've come back, but for some years, there was effectively no rabbit damage and there were no deer. So any seedlings that had established and were continually being nibbled back suddenly could explode and grow. And the 1959 management plan notes that there is this widespread cohort of ash and sycamore that is growing up in the woods. And that's what we're seeing in the woods now. Those are the trees that are, well, in the case of ash, dying. There was also some planting, both of oak and ash. So we've got it's not entirely a natural regeneration process, but it's the natural regeneration is predominantly the ash and sycamore. And as I say, why did the deer increase? Well, deer are a natural part, well, roe deer and red deer, natural part of our biodiversity. But in Britain, they've also been joined by fallow deer for the last 1,000-odd years since the conquest, and more recently by muntjac, which escaped from Woburn Park. But for much of the 19th century, deer had been largely eliminated from most of England and most of Wales. Just odd pockets like Exmoor or the New Forest still retained deer populations. And then, since the Second World War, they've been gradually spreading back through the country, and the distribution maps below show a comparison between where they were in 72 and by 2002. And if you just concentrate on the black symbols on those maps, that's the increase in the 30-year period from 72 to 2002, and they've continued to spread. So we're looking at, as I say, a period of when there weren't many deer, and now they are a major, one of the major limitations on broadleaf regeneration throughout Britain. Okay. But that still raises the question. Wytham is clearly ideal for growing ash. It wants to grow there. So what was keeping ash out of the canopy in the more distant past? Let's go back into the 19th century, which, remember, is still within the lifetime of an ash tree. So that happily grow to a couple, 300 years perhaps, without any problem. Well, actually, when we look at the map from 1761, the first thing that we should notice is that large parts of what we now think of as Wytham Woods were not woodland. The Great Wood in the north was there. Marley Wood, just above there, is there. But in between was marked on there as Wytham Common. Through the large areas of Bradbrook Common were open farmland. And it's only in the 19th century that they get brought into the woodland after the Enclosure Acts, and there was some areas were planted up. So we can, and the area of Marley Wood on the top right just illustrates the change in woodland area at from different times. So the blue is the woodland that appears to have been continuously wooded since medieval period, at least. So that's Marley Wood core is ancient. But then you have the red, which is part of the 5th Earl's plantings around 1820, when he was beautifying his estate and trying to keep it poacher-proof, unsuccessfully. And those are now sort of 200-year-old plantations, but were fields in 1761. And the green area, which is an area that the university planted up when it got the land in the 1940s. So, okay, some of the areas where the worst ash dieback is happening is because it's in areas of relatively recent woodland where ash either colonized or was planted in the last few hundred years. But it is also in the ancient woods as well. And it's still dying there. But that doesn't explain why it was not more prevalent in the canopy. But if we go back to other records, then we find that in 1797, we've got records of ash being sold from the estates, from the ancient woodland, but primarily for rake handles. Now, I don't know what size your rake handle is, but mine's about that diameter, about 2 or 3 centimeters across. In other words, they were cutting the ash when it was still young. They were probably cutting it, managing it as coppice. The diagram up there where you just cut the stems down, allow them to regrow, cut them again when they're still not very big. And any big trees that you've got there are almost certainly going to be oak, because oak was the valued timber. And you can see that in 1785, they did actually sell some oak ash trees from Wytham, but they only got 60 pence in modern money, 12 shillings in the old coinage per tree. Whereas when they were selling oak, they got £2.50 per tree, probably because they were bigger. And the painting there, which is by Millet, ignore the children in the front. That's some sort of fairy story, which unfortunately does not end well for the young girl. Do not accept strawberries from the squire's son. But the background is Marley Wood Plantation. It's documented that that's where he painted it. And that fits because that's one of the 5th Earl's plantings. And those are about 40 or 50 years old oaks. That's what it looked like then. And the picture down there, actually, it's not Marley Wood Plantation, but it's another area which we know the 5th Earl arranged for planting it in towards the end of his life, around 1840. So they were managing primarily for oak, and any ash was cut, on the whole, was cut when it was young, and that's why it was never in the canopy to any great degree prior to the 1940s, when coppicing and that style of management was abandoned and the woods were allowed to grow up. And they could grow up because the rabbits had died and the deer had not got away. So in summary, when we're looking at what wood is like now in terms of its composition, we've got to bear in mind that it's the process of a 19th century wood where they cut the ash out as much as they and kept it low, the consequences of World War II, fellings and limitation of regeneration by rabbits, then that being lifted, deer numbers coming up, stopping further regeneration and getting rid of the bramble. Now we got rid of the deer, bramble coming back, getting some regeneration again. Now we're getting ash dieback. And if you just try and look at the composition now and explain it in terms of some sort of environmental value variables, you'll miss all that. That's what Magnuson meant by the invisible present. And does it apply to other groups of organisms? Well, yeah, because if you try and explain the differences between populations of bank voles and wood mice, or what's been happening to chiffchaffs, which have declined, whereas great tits are not changed much over the last 50 years, then it's because of things which happened in the past. Bank voles try and escape predation by darting under low cover like bramble. Take out the bramble and the owls get the bank voles. Wood mice are more alert, so they're less dependent on cover. Chiffchaffs tend to forage and nest low down. They like low, dense bramble. Great tits, not bothered. They're nesting in holes or in Wytham in nest boxes. So trying to explain the differences in those pairs of species without knowing what's been happening to their habitat over a long period is a mistake. And again, other long-term studies throw up other examples of how you need to know what is going on, perhaps in the wider countryside. So 1960s, there weren't many sparrowhawks because all around the woods, crops were being treated with organochlorine pesticides. And that was building up in the sparrowhawks and their population crashed. The eggshells just got too thin and black. Meanwhile, the great tits were having a fine old time because their major predator had disappeared. And so then the thing that a great tit worries about is winter cold. And the way they cope with that is during the day, they eat as much as they can, build up body fat to get them through the freezing cold night. Simplifying this sort of thing. Now, the trouble with that is it makes you heavier. And you might then be more at risk from being caught by a predator. So once the sparrowhawks came back, there's a slight drop in the mean great tit weight, and they're building up less body fat because the risk of predation has gone up. There's a bit more of an advantage in being nimble. Again, when we go up to Wytham now, buzzards and red kites are common features above you. No longer think it unusual to see them. I never saw them when I was there in 74. Buzzard because it spread back because of reduced persecution. Red kite because it's now been reintroduced to the Chilterns and then has spread. So again, if we're trying to look at why we've got those large predatory birds present, we've got to look at the wider context. And here's an example from the long-term badger study, and we can the population numbers overall, and we can really divide it into 3 periods. We've got an early period when the population is generally rising because there was legal protection introduced to the badgers in the 1970s, and so the population starts to go up. There's a middle period when it seems to have reached carrying capacity, but one of the things they noticed in the badger catch-up was that there were a lot of bite marks on individuals. There was a lot of aggression, which sort of made sense. There's, if territorial animals, you'd expect lots of fighting at the boundaries. And so that seems to be what was happening. But then suddenly, from around 2000, you've got a little bit of a decline in the population, but not much. But the biting, the aggression seems to have disappeared. And so their conclusion is that for somehow, the badgers have found a way of living more cordially. They're sharing territories much more without this level of aggression. But depending on which period you were looking at, you would come to different conclusions. And we can see other changes going on. In invertebrates, we've got various butterflies that were frequent in the 1970s and 80s, being now largely lost, like a couple of the fritillaries and the white admiral. Various moths, which were frequent, now rare. But equally other species which were rare and are now common. And maybe some of those are changes due to changes in the way the woods are being managed or not managed, and loss of open habitats, the effects of deer taking out honeysuckle, which is the one of the food plants for the white admiral. Climate change is probably the reason behind some of these new arrivals. They're species that seem to be spreading generally through Britain. And there certainly are more lichens now. I don't know whether their diversity has increased. We haven't got very good lichen records for the woods over a long period, but we do know that the pollution climate is somewhat better now that we're no longer getting the fallout from didcot. So I hope I've convinced you that the invisible present, knowing the long-term changes that are going on, is quite important. And it's also important when we come to think about the future of the woods. I mean, this is the nearest I've found to some sort of long-term research strategy. It was written by Charles Elton in about 1966, saying that, well, the woods aren't virgin, recognizing they've been mucked about with over the years, but we could watch them develop. Although we don't know quite what a natural forest would look like. Would it be something like the top picture, which is the Biodiversity forest in Poland, mixture of lime and oak and ash and elm and things? Or would it be more like this sort of an open wood pasture thing? And this is Charles Tunnicliffe's painting of the Chillingham cattle up in Northumberland. Well, we don't know. But what we do know is that what we've got now, our starting point, is very much a cultural landscape. And so it's up to us to decide, well, do we need to worry about ash decline? After all, ash is, if you like, the abundance of ash we've got now is a relatively recent feature. And it's particularly in the areas that weren't woodland 200 years ago. Does it matter that they're dying? Does it matter actually if the oaks are dying? We know they've definitely been encouraged for the last probably 1,000 years. We're spending a lot of money getting rid of the fallow deer and the muntjac, well, their introductions. But should we actually be thinking about reintroducing red deer? They were present sort of around 1200 AD, because Henry II had the right to 2 red deer a year from the Wytham estate. Should we be taking out sycamore because it's a non-native tree? It's actually the species that's probably going to fill all the gaps that where the ash has gone. And the final point I'd like to make is that when those of you that are working in Wytham, or indeed any other site, should bear in mind that what you're doing is documenting what will become the invisible present for all future researchers. Because you're telling them what it's like now, and they're going to want to know in 20 or 30 years what it is like now, because it's the context for what they will be looking at. So that middle bay in my study is the last 50 years of the vegetation plot data. Most of it's in the Bodleian copied now. I've still got some 2023 stuff to get in there so that it won't get lost. And that brings me to the question of how do we keep these long-term research projects going? Much of the time, it does not produce exciting, innovative, high-ref impact papers. Research councils are not that keen on the whole on funding it. It doesn't progress researchers' careers very much because they're not doing something new. If you're following long-term research, you tend to have to use the previous researchers' methods. You're stuck. Often needs independent support to keep it going, and the enthusiasm of individuals. And that's very clear from Wytham. The badger work has been kept going essentially by David MacDonald and his enthusiasm, his ability to bring in funds from various sources. And the long-term work, well, it's benefited from having a bit of independent support through the Edward Gray Institute to cover the periods when there isn't a big research grant coming in. The data, the Dawkins plots, I fear they might have been lost if I hadn't happened to go along at the right time and pick them up from Collier. How do we ensure a handover to the next generation? And that's something I'm facing at the moment because I'm pretty certain I'm not going to be recording the Dawkins plots in 2028. I don't think I want to struggle through 2-meter high bramble for a start. So I've got to find someone to take that data on. But if nobody knows about them, nobody knows where the plots are, we need to ensure that we improve our data storage and dissemination. So my plea to you is to take account of the invisible present when you're doing your own research, but also bear in mind that your records are essential to make that invisible present visible for future researchers. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was fantastic talk. I'm just going to hog the mic while I've got the chance. I was wondering if I could ask you a question. It's a bit unfair because you said you don't know, but if you could speculate, what if we look back 2,000 or 5,000 years ago, what would you say based on your experience, what those woodlands would look like?
Well, I have got there is a bit of information because Wytham is unusual in that we've got a little fen there and there is a pollen core from it. It's not a very good pollen core, we have to say, because the fen, the peat has dried out a bit. But what it suggests is that the wood was probably predominantly lime, small leaf lime, Tilia cordata, oak. There is a trace of ash, but ash pollen doesn't show up in the core records very well, so we don't know exactly how much. And then we're also getting traces of alder and willow. So that's the sort of, there seems to be in those trees. Now, we don't know the structure and the absolute density of the, there would have been, 5,000 years ago, there would have been wild ox present, perhaps more on the floodplains than on the hill. And there would certainly have been red deer. Elk might just have been present by that stage, but I think they probably died out by that stage. So my feeling is the woods were more open than we would have said 20 or 30 years ago, but I think they would still have been largely a high forest with glades and probably quite large open areas on the floodplain because we'd have had a lot of beaver.
Any questions?
Hello, Keith. Thank you so much for the talk. Fantastic to see a woodland ecologist sort of integrating herbivory from the very start, and this focus on herbivory, whether it's natural or sort of human induced. I'm wondering a question about this sort of the value of long-term monitoring. Because you multiple times you alluded to these complex questions about what is natural, what would happen if there were wild ox in the woods. Have you how do you think about, on one hand, the value of sort of locking in on this management regime that is in the woods now, where you exclude almost all herbivory, right? As far as I know, deer are now sort of kept out of the woods completely, and the value of watching the woods in this sort of situation, because it's not, it's obviously it's not natural, right? Because there's no large herbivores in the woods, or whatever sort of amount of deer that you decide to, you will have to make that decision on one hand, because I guess that evidence becomes more and more interesting the more and more as the decades go. And on the other hand, what new questions that could arise? Something like, for example, okay, should we investigate the dynamics if we had wild ox? And then on one hand, you would potentially, that might be a good idea because you sort of had new realizations about natural woodland dynamics, but on the other hand, you would then, in a way, start over. I wonder if you could say something about these sort of prioritizations.
Well, I'm in a sense, happy position that my job is just to record the vegetation change. So if somebody decides they're going to put, if we decided to introduce wild ox or surrogate to the woods, fine. As long as I know which bits they're in, we can look at how the vegetation then changes. The thing is, though, we haven't excluded deer entirely. We've certainly brought the numbers down from where that peak of about 400 or so, where they were literally starving. You could pick a fallow deer up with one hand, according to the stalker at that stage. They're now fallow are down to about 20, roe, similar sort of number of muntjac. Who knows? But if we introduce wild ox, we could be looking at them. But again, the issue would be it's still a cultural landscape because we would be deciding how many elks we're going to put in there. And we would decide at some stage probably, there's either too few because they're not having any impact whatsoever, or there's too many because now they're interfering with what we think should be there. And that's the problem, that we haven't got a gold standard, and cannot have a gold standard as to what would happen, because we've got a new climate, we've got a different pollution climate, we've got introduced species which we can't, in practice, get rid of in terms of the trees and things, and unknown influences. We might get beaver back at some stage in the next 20 or 30 years on the Thames, but again, they won't be allowed to do what they did 5,000 years ago, because half of Oxford would probably go underwater. I don't think that will be allowed. So we're never going to be able to go that way. We can explore the ideas, and there was this sort of discussion a few years ago as to whether we should quite deliberately try and put part of the Wytham estate into some sort of rewilding management, and contrast it then to other parts which are more deliberately managed. That seems to have gone quiet at the moment, but yeah, it'd be an interesting experiment to do. And well, if we do that, then we can look at, we've got the background vegetation changes as well as other organisms as well, and see what impact it has. course, it might muck up one set of other people's long-term research. And they might have yet.
Thank you. If we could maybe return to the dynamics between the brambles and the trees, as you're the expert on this, I'm wondering if there's perhaps a middling degree of bramble cover that's actually beneficial to saplings when herbivory is high. If the brambles can sort of serve as a nurse species for these saplings at a certain point or a certain density or biomass, and if that's another dynamic that features in this research.
I mean, I think that's maybe more true when you've got invasion of open grassland rather than within a wooded situation. And what tends to happen is if you've got a middling level of herbivory that will let saplings get away, then I think it's having that herbivory down to that level, and bramble then might make a little bit of difference, but not that much. What we did find was that as the deer numbers were brought down, we were getting saplings developing and it was more that the saplings were starting to develop more at the same time as the bramble was going up. I don't think that, if you like, the bramble going up necessarily help the saplings much, because underneath a bramble thicket is pretty dark. The seedling would have to be growing pretty fast to get up above it.
Any more questions?
I should say that the bramble cover itself is a threat to some of the other ground flora. You peer underneath the bramble thicket and all you see is dead litter.
I was just wondering, given that the woods are and will always remain a cultural landscape, like how do we decide our priorities within that space of how we want to shape the landscape, and what impact does the sort of collection of long-term data have on that, given it probably is kind of circumstantial and changes as our global situation changes, if that makes any sense?
No, it's a purely value judgment that at some stage, I mean, it used to be the Wytham Management Committee that would, in effect, decide, well, are we going to do any thinning this year or not? And in the same way, it will now, I think, be the stewards of the Oxford Green Estate that at some stage will have to sign off a management plan that says, some of the plantation areas that were established in the 1940s will now have a final thinning, and then they will be left to minimum intervention. Minimum intervention, apart from controlling the deer to a particular level and either introducing cattle or not introducing cattle. And at the same time, it will be minimum intervention, but we've got to do safety thinning along the roads because we can't let ash fall on visiting researchers don't matter, visiting members of the public. Yeah, we can get more students, we can't get more public members. So yeah, it'll be a decision that a group will sit around the table and say. And we've got to accept that that is how most conservation objectives are set in Britain. We are conserving cultural landscapes. In a lot of cases, essentially, we're trying to conserve a 19th century chocolate box image of what the countryside was like. And whether that's appropriate for the future is another matter. And I think increasingly we will have to say, well, we can't, the 19th century is no longer an appropriate baseline to think about, even if we could get back there.
Any more questions? Really far away.
Um, do you, given obviously that things like the sort of short nature of academic positions means that people might not stay in a post long enough to do very extended observation of the place, do you think sort of citizen science means have a way of maybe bridging in the gap and ensuring that a consistent group of people who are able to help um, with this kind of observational work over a longer period of time, kind of in the way that some of the wildlife councils, or the wildlife trusts have sort of a consistent band of volunteers to do conservation work?
Yeah, certainly it can be appropriate for some types of study, and it's you run into issues of trying to maintain a consistency of how the work is done, and that can create some issues. So you probably still need someone that is going to be organizing that. But yes, the citizen science can help with bodies on the ground actually getting out there and doing the work, as long as there's someone who's maintaining the quality control. And there's some good examples from Wytham of those sorts of projects being done, and the quality of the work being as good as getting, if you like, professional researchers doing it.
Thanks, Keith. So lots of what you said pointed out how difficult it is to, know how best to manage the woods. So, and if you look back at the story you describe, there are obviously lots of unexpected things that happened in there, really. So, I don't know. Do you think if you imagine you could see forward through all of that period, what can we learn from that we could apply to going forward? You said a little bit about, it's not appropriate to keep the old view, but can you go any further? What would be your best guesses based on all that experience as to what we should be doing for the next period ahead?
I think one of the things we've got to decide is to recognize that there are things like climate change is happening, that some of the things that we're worried about, like the oak decline, may be almost an artifact of the fact that we've got the legacy of 19th century planting of oak for timber, for ships. That's why they were doing it in the 1820s. Trafalgar, we've got to replace those boats because we need them for the wooden wall. Now, that may be why we've got a lot of oak death, because we overstood it. Now, unfortunately, oak is really good for all the birds. And so and has this also iconic position, so that people get very worried about oak death. And Nigel keeps being told he's got to plant some more oak. But maybe we should just accept that oak is going to decline a bit further. And we might start thinking, well, there was more small-leaved lime 5,000 years ago than there is in the wood now. The hybrid limes that were planted in the 1890s and 1820s, in that period, they're doing very well. Small-leaved lime probably will cope well with future climate change. So maybe we should be, if we're going to do any planting, we should be introducing that, maybe introducing a few other species from more southern Europe, accepting sycamore as a species that probably would have got here if the land bridge hadn't disappeared when it did, and if people hadn't been buggering up the countryside, to use a technical term, for the last few thousand years to stop it spreading. And so we should be accepting that the composition will change. And maybe we should also be thinking about bringing in the surrogates from some of the other things, elements that were present in the past. And so make a deliberate decision that which of the changes that are likely to happen we can resist, and most of them we can't. We just have to accept, and which we can help to direct. So do a bit of assisted migration of species, and then follow what happens to them. So we might introduce small lead line in a few places and see whether it does establish, whether it is able to regenerate. And then if we did introduce cattle into parts of the wood, well, do they actually have a major impact? Or do they just concentrate on the little bits of grass that are left and hardly ever go into the rest of the wood? It would, I think we're at quite a critical time, I think, for Wytham with the new green estate. It's an opportunity to actually develop a formal research strategy for what the woods are like, set it up. We'll probably make the wrong decisions, but at least we'll have made some decisions and said, this is where we think it's going. Now let's test whether those are right.
I just wanted to quickly do one from online, which follows on from this very closely. It's from Victoria McNamara. She says, as all the data suggests, biodiversity is continuing to seriously deplete across the UK, and if in reality we actually have been managing our landscapes to deliver what we need economically and culturally for hundreds or thousands of years, should we not be more deliberate and intentional in planning what we need to go forward?
I think we've got to be deliberate and try and plan things, because we've got down to the position where we've got just islands of reasonable diversity left. And most of that change, a lot of the changes that have happened are a bit accelerated in effectively the last century. And the problem that we've now got is that because everything is compressed into these small areas, and in a lot of cases, the things are only able to survive in those small areas because of past management and maintaining that past management. We can't just, as it were, step back completely, because by the time the cyclical process is re-established, we'll have lost some of the species that we want to come in, and there won't be the sources close by. So we've got to sort of handle this transition to ideally what John Lawton was arguing for 15 years ago, or promoting the idea that we need much bigger wildlife-friendly areas, managed ideally less intensively so that we can let natural processes or more natural processes develop in response to the changing climate and so on. But it's something that is going to take time to develop.
I think maybe you just answered it. I wondered if you thought that Wytham should be rewilded or managed like other woods in the southern UK, so that the science there can be comparable with what's going on with woods that are managed for other things that isn't rewilding.
Well, in a sense, about a third of the wood has been being rewilded since 1940, because about a third of the wood is nominally minimum intervention. And so there hasn't been any forestry management in those areas. The management has only been controlling the deer, because you can't control it in the rest of the wood and not control it not include the minimum intervention areas. So we have had that. And what actually was a missed opportunity was in the 1960s, when there was in effect a bust-up between the forestry department, which had been initially given the management of the wood in the 1940s, and the ecologists, because if a compromise had been reached then, we could have had about a third of the wood being managed along modern forestry lines, as it was seen then, towards a broadleaf final crop, and a third of the wood being, at least a third of the wood being managed or left alone. But in practice, and we would have had the comparison of what does modern forestry and productive forestry add or detract in species terms compared to just leaving the areas alone. Unfortunately, because I think largely because I'm sure my interpretation is a personality clash between Charles Elton and Professor Laurie, who was the forestry professor. They didn't come up with a compromise. The foresters basically took their bags and left. The plantations were just left, not thinned as they should have been, according to management plans. And I'm afraid, I don't think the ecologists really have done much in those plantations. So we haven't got that, even the comparison of neglect of plantations versus neglect, if you like, of semi-natural areas. But it would have been a nice comparison to make, and we could, again, it was what we were sort of talking about a few years ago, of trying to reinstate something like that.
If there are, is it a pressing question? Or we can have, if there's any more questions, but otherwise we can meet in the atmosphere room and we can have some drinks there and catch up. Would you like?
One quick one. Speaking of introductions, has anybody looked at the impact of grey squirrels?
Oh dear. No. It was the short answer. The slightly longer answer is yes, there's been about two, maybe three PhDs done on grey squirrels over the last 60 years. Despite the fact that that's one of the topics which would have most wider impact on woodland management across the country. Again, deer have not actually been that studied. Again, we've did 2 or 3 defills. So while we know an awful lot about badger populations, unfortunately, we don't know a lot about what has been driving deer or grey squirrel populations in the wood and what impacts they're having.
Okay. Well, then atmosphere rooms down this hallway, just follow the crowd. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for a really great talk.